case of Russia, it was a little bit slower, but it started earlier with World War I. By the time we got to the post-Cold War collapse, the birth rate fell so far that the Russians now, today, are simply not able to man their army. This is their last gasp. This is their last chance if they're going to rewrite the borders. And that brings us back to geography. Because if you look at a map of Russia, the population lives in kind of this sideways V going from the European side to the Asian side, getting thinner as it goes. But there are no natural boundaries around it, no oceans, no mountains, no deserts. It's a lot of open territory that the Mongols crossed, the Germans crossed. They've been invaded 50 times. But all 50 of those times, the invader has come through one of 9 gateway territories, like the Polish Gap or the Bessarabian Gap. So the Russian plan is, with this last chance they have, to forward deploy to those gaps and plug them before they lose the military capacity to even try. So this was always their last chance, and Ukraine was never the end of it. It's actually step 4, I would argue, after things like Crimea and Georgia and Nagorno-Karabakh and Kazakhstan. And it's not the end, because they still have to get to Bessarabia, they still have to get to Poland, they still have to get to the Baltic. So when they're done with Ukraine, we still have 6 more countries. There's not a lot of leadership left. We're in this weird situation because of the demographics that they now have a total national elite of probably only about 150 people. And so every time one of them slips in the shower and falls on some bullets or chokes on a chicken bone or whatever it happens to be, it's a national crisis because these people are irreplaceable. They're survivors from the KGB cadre from the late Cold War. They haven't trained up any new ones. They haven't had the institutional capacity to do that. So here in the United States, our elite is over 2 million people. Because you can get into it from business, you can be a public servant like Biden, you can do a reality TV show and get elected like Trump, you can be in show business like Reagan. There's any number of ways, and it's a very churny, regenerating system. The Russians do not have that. So this is their last chance in terms of demographics, in terms of economics, in terms of military, in terms of leadership. They have to do it now. I'm not privy to their interior mail like apparently the CIA is now, which, oh my God. The CIA has gotten really good, or NSA, whoever's doing it has gotten really good at reading Putin's mail. I know this was under discussion before they really went into lockdown 5 years ago. The degree to which it's driving their day-to-day decision-making, I'm not privy to that, but if they're not, it's a really insane coincidence. It's always been inevitable. There's always been a question of whether it was imminent. Obviously, we're there now. There's something that a lot of people in the foreign policy space have been saying for years, that we pushed them into this to a degree, that by expanding NATO, we made them more and more unstable, more and more paranoid. And there's something to be said for that, because the Russians have always known they had to get these gaps. But the only version of Russian security that would have satisfied Russia is if the Russians were able to write the security policies or occupy a number of countries with a combined population of twice of their own. That was never a viable option. So these critics, they're right, but they're also stupid. I think what really drove the Russians to do it right now, as opposed to 8 years from 8 years ago, but why February, is when Trump was president. I'm sure you remember all the impeachment fun and games. The core issue there was that Trump tried to blackmail the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, into getting dirt on Hunter Biden in exchange for continuing military support of Ukraine.
This is the phone call, the infamous phone call.
This was the phone call. Well, it's the Trump administration released the transcript, so it's not. None of this is controversial. Whether or not that's an impeachable offense, I will leave that to Congress. But what we know for sure is that Trump tried to do the blackmail. It didn't work, and so he withheld military assistance. And so the military assistance that had been slowly building up stopped for a couple of years. And it wasn't until we get to the Biden presidency that it picked up again in large scale. And it wasn't until the Biden administration became in power that some of the weapon systems that we had provided, we gave them permission to use them on that eastern front where the separatists were. That started in November of last year. Those weapons finally faced the Russians in November. That's when the buildup in Russia started. They realized that the window for them was closing very quickly. Because if you can operate a Nintendo Game Boy, a Javelin missile's easy. And all of a sudden they were losing armor and and trucks to javelins a dozen a week. And they realized that if they didn't act soon, Ukraine wouldn't be nearly as easy to fall. And now we're in a situation where I think we've provided them with something like 3,000 launchers. So the Russians can still win, but the cost is going to be very, very high. There are 3 countries in human history that have threatened the United States. Britain, with Lend-Lease in World War II, they became our junior ally. We will never let them out of that position. Mexico, we invaded them. We took half their territory. We're best buds now. Russia, that pointed nukes at us, that still points nukes at us, that never stopped pointing nukes at us. Destabilizing that is kind of hardwired into the American strategic ethos, and it's hard for me to find fault with that. Yeah, I'd actually argue that the Biden administration, which never wanted to get into a war with Russia in the first place, is actually more concerned about that and more concerned about avoiding it now because the Russians have done so badly in Ukraine. We now know that if it comes to a face-to-face fight between American forces and Russian forces, that we will obliterate them. Absolutely. There's no other way this could go. There's for a country with the lack of military expertise, equipment, and funding of Ukraine to be standing up to Russia. Are the Ukrainians overperforming? Sure, but the Russians are they're coming across like the Iraqis in Desert Storm. They just don't seem to know even how to drive a truck down a road without running out of gas. There's a 40-mile column of armored vehicles and tanks coming down from Belarus that has now been stalled for over a week because it ran out of fuel, and then it ran out of food, and everyone just had to leave their vehicles and walk back to Belarus. That's insane. So if you put that against the U.S. Army and Air Force, oh my God.
Did that surprise you?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. That the Russians could have lost all of the lessons that they learned in Chechnya and Syria. And here they are in a real war that really means something to them strategically. And all of a sudden, they're just collapsing. In a scenario of an American-Russian clash now, the Russians have 2 options: a humiliating retreat and nukes. And so if you are Biden, you were thinking that Ukraine was going to fall relatively quickly, and you would then feel this insurgency. There's now this outside chance that Ukraine might actually succeed at fighting off the Russians. It'll be bloody, it'll be painful, it'll take years. But if the Ukrainians can stay in the game against this foe, then the foe isn't all that. It's not a balance. It's you give the Ukrainians everything they possibly can use in a guerrilla format. Because as long as that is going on, as long as that war is happening, as long as the Russians are locked down, they can't move to the next step. And the Russians are highly unlikely to use nukes against Ukraine, because you want to talk about humiliation. Nuking your fellow Serbs who stood up to you without them even having a military, I don't think the Russians would consider that an option, because honestly, it wouldn't achieve anything for them. So from the Biden administration's point of view, from the Germans, from the Swedes, from everybody in the West point of view, this is how we prevent World War III. We make sure that Russia dies in Ukraine. Putin has really isolated himself. He's not taking it. He's not as bad as Obama. He's not as bad as Chairman Xi in China, but he's like a close third in terms of how isolated he is now from everyone in terms of figuring things out. And so it's entirely possible that he has a bit of a snap and decides to throw a nuke into the fray. If he does that, Sweden and Poland will have nukes before the end of the year, as will a number of other countries. That is a way to guarantee the death of Russia from a strategic bleed out.
Interesting. So say they do launch a nuke, and say that weather, because they would probably look at the weather and make sure that wind is not blowing back towards Russia.
It seems reasonable.
And see, it blows the other way over, let's say, a NATO member country.
Yeah, I can't think of a better way to guarantee that NATO actually is worthy of the name, but it would come at the cost of a number of NATO countries. Let's throw Germany into that list too, immediately starting a nuclear weapons program. Any country that has a nuclear power plant can build a nuke in under a year. It's a non-proliferation pledge issue as to why they've not. But if a nuke is used on your eastern frontier, you can guarantee that a number of countries are going to join that club very, very quickly.
Let's say that a nuke does go off, whether it's a tactical nuke or an old suitcase nuke that they get going again and bring it in, and that thing goes off. What do you think that the United States would then do?
I mean, we're piling ifs upon ifs here, but we would definitely return the nuclear fleet to Europe.
And would we respond in kind in defense of, let's say, a NATO
Ukraine
country?
is not a NATO
over?
ally, so I can't imagine that we would respond in kind, but we would make it very clear that any hope that the Russians now thought that they had of securing those gateways is now completely off the table. And now it's just a question of how Russia fades from the world as opposed to when.
Yeah, so it's inevitable that Russia's on the decline and heading out some way. It's just the way.
Yeah, American policy for the last 30 years has been about buying time when it comes to Russia. It's like we know we're going to outlive them. We know that the Russians are going to lose control of the Russian Federation probably in the 2050s or 2060s. And so as long as we can prevent a Russian lash out from causing us real damage, we're good. We're now seeing a lash out. Now, it's not against the West's interests directly, but it has provided an opportunity for Russia to be stuck in a mess of its own making that very few countries that matter are on the other side of. Of course, the biggest country that's on the other side of this is China. And I would argue, just because of a layout of the infrastructure and the resources in Russia, that all the sanctions on Russia are actually going to cause as much damage to the Chinese as to the Russians.